evening, everybody, and welcome to Resistance Recovery. I am delighted to serve as an introduction to Kent Dunnington and Bruce Alexander. They had not met each other prior to today, although they were well aware of each other's work. Just for the record, they are the authors of my two favorite books on addiction. And I won't say which one's number one and which one's number two. But with that, I thought we might start by just talking to Kent a little bit about his book, Addiction and Virtue, and the impact that Bruce's thought had on the writing of that book.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Piers. It's good to be with you again. And it is an honor to be with Bruce because I've known his work and admired it from afar for a while. And so you asked about the impact of Bruce's work on my own book, which is called Addiction and Virtue. And, you know, it's funny, really, the main thing that I knew from Bruce's work when I wrote the book, the book was actually written in mostly in 2007 and 2008. And I knew all about the Rat Park stuff, which I found really interesting, and it was aligning, it made sense of a lot of the intuitions that I had about how the addiction conversation had been maybe over medicalized and had become too atomized, too much of a focus on the addicted individual as opposed to the addicted society. And so I think I referenced those experiments in my book, but it wasn't until so the book actually didn't get published, I think, until 2011. And when I went back to revise it significantly, I tried to catch up on the latest stuff, but I actually never read Bruce's book, The Globalization of Addiction. I didn't read that until a few years ago, and I honestly still don't know how it slipped through the cracks of my research, but it was a kind of striking experience. I read it a couple years ago, and it was just amazing. I would list that as my favorite book on addiction. And I had all this stuff underlined, and you know, at several places saying, you know, I said this, to the point where I thought Bruce had read my book and was incorporating it. And then I looked at the publication date, which I think is it 2008, Bruce? And so that was published before my book. And so I think it's amazing to me, you know, I come at this not as an addiction scientist. I come at it as a philosopher and theologian who is trained in virtue ethics and trained to think about the way that habits work and the way that our environment shapes our habits. And so I brought those intuitions to try to make sense of the literature that I was reading in addiction studies, which is highly medicalized, and, you know, develop this thesis. And then to come along and read Bruce's work, which, to be honest, is it's just much more acquainted with all the nooks and crannies of the literature, and to see that he was thinking along similar lines was really validating. In fact, I remember going through the book and just thinking, like, okay, is there anything that we disagree about? What could we have a conversation about? There's not much, but yeah, it was mainly the Rat Park stuff that got my engines turning. And then later reading Bruce's Globalization of Addiction, I just thought, I think the subtitle of his book is like Poverty of Spirit. And that's a lot of what I tried to write about, is that there's this powerful spiritual or theological dimension to addiction that is suppressed, sometimes intentionally so, in the contemporary discourse on addiction. And I think Bruce is just really brilliant about all of that.
And Bruce, your acquaintance with Kent's work.
Well, I'm still reeling with that very kind statement about about Ken's acquaintance with my work, and thank you for making my day uh, very much. Um, and I have to be honest. Um, I've only I've only seen the two Biola University lectures. I have not read Addiction and Virtue, and that's because uh, there just hasn't been time. But I have when I watched the first of those two lectures, I immediately started incorporating Kent in all my bibliographies, and I realized what he has realized, which is that we think very similarly, and I rejoice in that, because we're thinking very similarly, but he of course is thinking from a very um, you know, primary Christian viewpoint, and I am not. I am thinking from a non-believer's viewpoint, and yet that confluence is it just, well, it's something to rejoice about as far as I'm concerned. And Kent mentioned it was hard to find one thing that we disagreed upon, but I found one thing, and
Good.
and I want to that one thing I really want to delve into if there's time for it today, and that is in Kent's first Biola lecture. He says addiction is basically a new word, and I want to say, whoa, wait. No, addiction is an ancient word. It's older, in fact, than Christianity. It goes back to the early Roman Empire, and I understand what Kent means, of course, which is that the idea of addiction as a medical disease of alcohol and drug abuse is a new concept that goes back only to the 19th century, and that's a new concept, which gives us all a problem because we don't, none of the three of us, I think, like that concept. But um, the amazing thing is the change in the word addiction, and sort of my hobby horse today is the fact that addiction has changed its meaning so fundamentally, beginning around the beginning of, well, let's say 500 years ago, as the modern era comes into focus. Addiction begins to change its meaning, and it changes it dramatically. And I think that story is a very important one. I hope we get a chance to delve into that today.
Well, I'm game. Ken?
Sure, yeah. I imagine Bruce knows that story a lot better than I do. Most of my acquaintance with it is through the work of a scholar named Peter Ferenczi. Are you familiar with him, Bruce?
Sure, he's a Canadian.
Okay, yeah. And I just remember an article that he wrote where he talks about not so much the invention of the word addiction, which you're quite right, Bruce. As you mentioned earlier, it's in the Bible, or it's in the King James translation of the Bible, and but Ferenczi talks about maybe we might say that the modern concept of addiction is distinctively modern.
Yes.
And Ferenczi talks about patterns of drunkenness in the Middle Ages, and how certain features that we identify with drunkenness now, things like solitary drinking, were just not a part of drunkenness in the early Middle Ages. And so he uses that to speculate that what we think of as a sort of natural kind, a person who's addicted, and that brings with it things like solitary use and all this stuff, that there is no natural kind, that our modern concept of addiction maps onto a very specific shift in communal nature, economics, all of this stuff. And if we treat it like a natural kind, we're sure to obscure the very things that we should be assessing and diagnosing, things like what has happened to to the way we do community, and what has happened to the way we do economics, and what has happened to the way we think about religion and its role in a person's life and a community's life. So I do think, whether you think of it as the change in a word, the change in the meaning of the word, or the construction of a new concept, something really powerful shifted in modern times, and we're now sort of wrestling with that legacy.
Yeah.
For the sake of clarity, when you use the term natural kind, you mean like a universal, or like a hazard of being human?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's some philosophy speak. We draw a distinction between natural kinds and social kinds, and natural kinds are sort of the way the world. I mean, some people don't believe there are any natural kinds, but if you think that there is a way the world is independent of human activities of organization, there's a certain way the world is carved at the joints, say, so that rocks really are distinct things, different from trees. And we haven't just made that distinction for purposes of human convenience. That would be a natural kind, or maybe some of the differences we think of between the species or natural kinds. On the other hand, a category like race is a great example. Race is not a natural kind, it's a human construct that is traceable to a history of, oppression. Not all social kinds are bad, though. And much of the current debate over sexuality and gender is about whether we're tracking natural kinds or whether we're dealing with so-called social kinds. So what I'm suggesting is that addiction, or any concept that has a sort of medical, that we associate with science, we're tempted to think of it as a natural kind, like science discovers the way that the world works, the way that human biology works, and it's just purely descriptive. And what I think Ferenczi's work and Bruce's work helps us see is that addiction is a highly pliable concept. And if we treat it as a natural kind, that's just this thing that shows up in every civilization, it's exactly the same wherever it shows up, then we fail to ask the questions about all of the social conditions that actually produce patterns that we then characterize as addictive patterns. Does that make sense, Piers?
Oh yeah, you just gave me a lot of ammo. So Bruce, let's unpack this a little bit. The change that occurred, and what it was, and the forces behind it.
Yes. And I will attempt to be brief. If I'm not brief enough, don't hesitate to intervene because I don't want to talk too much. But the word addiction is obviously not a natural kind. It's always been contested since it came into existence roughly 300 or 400 years before Jesus in the Roman Republic, before the Roman Empire. And people argue about it, and it is in fact uniquely arguable. There's a class of words which seem to contradict themselves, and linguists have put it in that category. It's a word which seems to be both a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. And so jump up to the time of Shakespeare. Now we have I want to mention a book by Rebecca Lemon like the fruit. And it's an incredible book called Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England, in which she says, look at Shakespeare, look at Christopher Marlowe, look at the King James Bible, and you'll see addiction being used more often than not as something very positive and as something very Christian. So people are, in the King James Bible, we say that the family Stephanus is addicted to the ministry of the saints, and that's why they're a good family. And so on. If we look at Faust, we see that he's the legendary character, Dr. Faustus, we see that he is addicted to his studies of theology, and that's a good thing. Later, he gets addicted to the devil, and that's a bad thing. So addiction is primarily a good thing. And what I want to say for today is take that idea seriously for a minute. Let's just say that she's right. Let's say that there is a great deal of wisdom in the English language or in any language. There's a great deal of accumulated wisdom. And let's say there is a thing called addiction, which is more often a good thing than a bad thing, but can be very bad, can be deadly bad, but is more often good. And play with that idea and see where it gets us. Well, the first thing that gets us is we have to realize. Oh, and by the way, the definition of addiction in this context is simply definition 1A from the Oxford English Dictionary, where addiction is defined as a kind of devotion or dedication which is immoderate. In other words, if you're addicted in this early modern English meaning of the word, it's not just that you're devoted, like you're super devoted, or you're super dedicated, or you're super attached. These are all synonyms for addiction. So here's my thing. Take that idea seriously for a second, even though it violates our normal way of speaking. Of course, it's foreign to our normal way of speaking, but take it seriously for a minute. What do you see? You see, number one, that society is held together by addiction. I mean, think about Mother's Day. What's Mother's Day about? Mother's Day is about the fact that moms are not just devoted, but the really good moms, the ones that we want to bring the candy and the flowers to. These moms are super devoted, and they made our lives work for us, and we care about that. And we want to encourage other moms to be like that. That's why we celebrate Mother's Day. We don't just know that about our moms, we celebrate it publicly because it's part of our culture, is the celebration of that kind of addiction. And think of the other addictions which make society work. I mean, obviously, any kind of family addiction in this broad sense, let's say family devotion. Let's think of the kind of devotions to work and innovation and technology, which give us the whole gamut of modern technology. These things were not invented by guys who worked 8 hours a day and then went home and watched the game. These these things were invented by guys who worked all their hours and went home and did their very best to try to be family people as well, and put all their energy into creating what this device we're talking on right now, this incredible device. Not to mention the incredible microwave oven which warmed up my coffee before we began. Addiction makes society work. If you happen to have read studies of the American Army or really any army in modern times, you'll see that armies do everything they can to make the men in units addicted to each other, because those men have to go out and save each other's lives at the risk of their own lives every day in combat. Addiction is the difference between a winning army and a losing army. So that's what, and this is not just me mouthing off. This is the language. This is our language. Our English language has this concept of addiction in it. But think, okay, take it one more step. Addiction is absolutely essential, not only socially, but psychologically. If a person doesn't have a real devotion in their life, a real dedication, what do we say about that person? well, we're sorry for them, right?
Mm,
They don't have a life.
mm,
Um, they're empty. Um, they're pathetic. And if a person doesn't have that kind of a beneficial addiction in their life, what do? Well, we know what they do. They find a substitute addiction, and it might turn out to be alcoholism, or it might turn out to be pornography on the internet, or it might turn out to be one of these ugly things. But we find to the degree that we work with addicted people all the time, we can see it's the idea of a perilous gift, Kent, your idea of a perilous gift. Addiction, it always gives a gift.
mm.
And it gives the gift at your own peril, and indeed in the long run at your own loss. But of course we understand it. Why do people do it? It's not because they want to ruin their lives. It's because they want the gift. They must have the gift. So addiction is an essential. And then, so here's my final thought. I will not go on forever. Um, this meaning of addiction essentially disappears. Now, I bear in mind that the old meaning of addiction is not only positive, it very much recognizes the fact that positive addictions shift into negative addictions and kill people. That wasn't neglected in the old definition. But at some point, the positive part of the definition drops out. Why does it drop out? Why does addiction go from being something which is entirely not entirely, but predominantly positive, to something which is entirely negative? Why does that happen? And Rebecca Lemon doesn't answer that question in her book, so I will answer the question in the wisdom of old age, since I have not done any formal research on this. But the positive meaning of addiction drops out because at some point in the 19th century, we start to get terrified by addiction. We look around us and we see all these drunks, and we begin to see all these people who are freaking out on morphine. And we even begin to see, dare I mention it, we even begin to see mothers who are not only addicted to opium, but addicted to mothering. So that now we have a book called Momaholics. And overprotective mothers. And we begin to see addiction. We begin to see the threat of addiction. Why do we begin to see it just now, just in the 19th century, in the 20th and the 21st? Because modern society is going to hell in a handbasket, and we are generating more and more and more dangerous addictions in people who can't have positive addiction. Let's say the kind of addictions we would want to have, like devotions. And we're seeing more and more addictions. So of the horrible kind, of the lethal kind. And what do? We put addiction in a box. We say, oh, no, addiction isn't this complicated thing, which is positive mostly, but can go wrong. Addiction is just this totally negative thing caused by alcohol or caused by drugs. And the people who are doing that are not just people like you and I, even though we feel these addictive urges ourselves. Oh, no, we don't really feel those addictive urges. Those addictive urges belong to people who are going to be addicted to alcohol or drugs. And we got to get those guys either into jail or into medical treatment, or at least into harm reduction, because that's where our focus has to be. That's my story for the day. Thank you for listening to this long story. But everybody should read Rebecca Lemon's book, I think, Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England, because I think she's opening up a new chapter here.
Well, listening to you, it takes me back to Addiction and Virtue. especially when, Kent devotes quite a bit of time and correct me, I might get the terminology a little wrong, but when you talk about addiction affords us, I think it's something like a freedom from an arbitrary sense of identity. And Kent speaks really beautifully to that a human being really wants, I mean, you use the word ecstasy. I want to give myself over to something larger for the sake of something bigger in the interest of excellence. And would that be, Kent, to your way of thinking, what Bruce means by the positive idea of addiction?
Absolutely. There's so much in what Bruce said that that I want to comment on, but let me just make a couple of comments. So yes, Piers, one of the main points that I want to make in the book is that we have come to conceptualize addictive urges as though they're a distinctive category of human desire and one that is necessarily destructive, when in fact they're just part of what Aquinas calls infinite human desire. Aquinas says we have infinite desire, and therefore, in Aquinas's theological outlook, it's something that can only ultimately be satisfied by God. So for Aquinas, Aquinas thinks that the promise of caritas, the love of God, is that here is something that we can be absolutely devoted to in a way that is thoroughly immoderate, and it will not wreck us. It's the one object of our desire that we can pursue with absolute immoderation. And not only will it not wreck us, but Aquinas thinks that rightly pursued, it will allow us to appropriately gauge our other loves. So our familial loves, our loves for country, our loves for work and the goods of the economy, so on and so forth. Now, of course, this isn't going to be compelling to you if you don't have a basically theistic outlook, but it makes much the same point that Bruce is trying to make, which is that if we think we're going to deal with addiction by cordoning off addictive urges, saying that they're all bad and the way to resolve addiction is to become people with small desires or people who live a fundamentally detached way of life. If Bruce is right about fundamental human psychology, that might be a fool's errand. And this is the last comment I'll make on this. I do think it's really interesting how prominent Buddhism has become in the contemporary conversations about addiction and recovery. And if you think that the problem is that human beings have too much desire, and that the only way to deal with excessive or immoderate desires is to become someone who lives a fundamentally detached life where there's nothing that you are absolutely devoted to, then Buddhism makes a lot of sense. I mean, the way to deal with addiction is to become a more and more detached person. But if you think, as Bruce is just suggesting, that there's something essential to human well-being, to strong desire and to being devoted to certain things, then you're going to think that in some ways you're working at cross purposes with human nature. And so what I argue for in my book is that, at least from a Christian perspective, the right response to what we now think of as addictions is not to become more and more detached, but to have the right attachments, or to put it in Bruce's terminology, is to have the right addictions,
Yeah. I have a question for you, Kent. Was Aquinas right in the sense that you can't go too far within let's say, in your devotion to God? And what comes to my mind, of course, is the famous kinds of bad Christians, like the inquisitors and so forth. is he right in some way that you can't go too far in that particular form of devotion?
Yeah. Well, I hope he is. I mean, it would be bad. It would be a bad outcome for Christian theology if it turned out that our devotion to God was supposed to be somehow moderated.
Yeah.
So I hope he is right. But the question is, how can we tell when what we think is our absolute devotion to God? This is the question from a Christian perspective. It's almost a given of Christian theological thought that we could never be too devoted to God. So then the question is how to make sense of the kinds of things that you just described, Bruce. And so certainly we can be overly devoted to a certain theological outlook. That's what leads to things like the Inquisition. Certainly we can be overly devoted to a story we tell ourselves about who God is and who other people need to believe God is, and so on and so forth. So I think that route is only promising if we believe that Christian practices, devotional practices, have within them the resources to guard us against the kinds of self-deception that lead to doing great violence and destruction to others in the name of religion, so on and so forth. So it's not a simple matter at all. And I take your warnings very seriously. But ultimately, I do think Christians have to say, no, we cannot be immoderately devoted to the true God. Of course, that's part of why I've written so much on humility. It takes an extraordinary amount of humility not to convert our devotion to God into yet another project of self aggrandizement and that sort of thing.
Oh, I'm looking forward to reading that book. Thank you. The humility book.
Well, it feels like there's this place where these various themes come together. And, so when we're talking about addiction in the negative sense, we are ultimately talking about something that, at least as it progresses, confining it to substances, that it rends the social fabric. So that is one of the ways that we know that we're moving from something that is positive or neutral into this negative territory. And I feel like one of the great gifts of your work, Bruce, for those of us who are theist or Christian otherwise, is that you really shine a light on an understanding of spirituality that really emphasizes the relational. And I would suggest that may be one way of understanding when this sort of overzealous quality can enter into, when my addictive and beyond substances at this point could be to my church, starts coming at the expense of my relationships, starts denigrating others or excluding or shunning others. Is that fair?
Oh, I think so. I mean, isn't it the case that the person that we all want to be is a person who is devoted and intensely devoted to God or to our family, but really devoted to more than one thing. That's my ideal anyway. Maybe that isn't the universal ideal, but my ideal is that any devotion can be excessive, that therefore it's our gift as human beings that we are capable of multiple devotions, not large numbers, but more than one, and that somehow that's what makes us fully human. And of course, in that condition, we don't do anything to the degree that it wrecks our families, or it wrecks our health, or whatever. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but
I just wanted to know if I was on the right track. Because one of the ways that, Kent, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you start breaking down habit in the philosophical sense in your work, I think that's very translatable into Bruce's theory, meaning that we're getting these moral goods out of these habits that really should be, or in a healthy sense, would be satisfied through our relationships.
Well, I don't think it's an either or. I mean, there certainly are all kinds of moral goods that are satisfied through relationships, probably most. But my idea is not that I mean, there are habits that direct us to goods that go beyond the goods of relationship, right? I mean, there are goods of learning and goods of just sheer aesthetic enjoyment and that sort of thing. But I do think there's something right in your basic point, Piers, which is that, you know, if we take Bruce's line and say we are to be a people, human beings are naturally creatures that seek to be devoted to things that are bigger than themselves, and a fully developed or a flourishing human being is going to be someone with multiple devotions to family and to community and to country or whatever. The question then is, how do we know when those devotions have are too intense? Because Bruce draws attention to devotions to religion that have done great damage. But of course, it's easy for us to think about examples of devotion to family or devotion to country that have done enormous damage. You know, we need only read the autobiographies of people who were in the Third Reich to see how easily one in devotion to one's country and to what one thinks one should naturally be devoted to can do enormous damage. So, you know, the question is, if we have this notion of good kinds of addiction that we should be pursuing, are there any standards by which we can check whether our devotions are leading to flourishing? And I'm wondering, Piers, if you're suggesting that the quality of our relationships or something like that is our main benchmark.
Well, I mean, my reading of your work, you know, the intractability of certain habits, meaning heroin or alcoholism, is because where we're not making connection, we now make connection with the substance. And so, like, one of the examples you use is freedom from loneliness. No one would say that's not a moral good. But when that freedom from loneliness is, you know, me in a vodka bottle, that's, now we're not in a healthy territory at all, as opposed to freedom from loneliness to have this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I'm dealing with in my work, and it's worth stating, is that I'm seeing a wave of young people now who really don't have any prior history with social skills, social intelligence, eye contact, conversation, manners, And I used to think that they were somehow, because of digital devices and drugs and such, that they were disinterested in other people. And of late, I'm beginning to wonder if they've lost interest in themselves, and that there's even a way of relating to oneself that is disappearing. So it's very, and you can say to a room full of addicts, you can say, think back to when drugs were really working for you. That's the kind of language we talk. You know, when the bar was this welcoming cheers kind of place, or when you were running with your crew and you had all this sort of thing going on. And was that not the most, I don't use this term, but what Bruce would call integrated time of your life? Most pleasurable, integrate, and they will all raise their hands. And so part of the challenge of recovery becomes, you know, we're trying to offer you something that in lieu of that, you know, they don't, it's almost impossible to believe that that could happen. So it's,
Can I
please.
extend that a little in another direction about another generation? I live on an island, and it's about 2,500 people on this island. About half of them are retired people. Many are in their 80s, like me, and many in their 70s and 60s. And of course, there's a lot of social life, and we're very happy with our island and so forth. But one of the things which I notice is a drinking culture, and none of the people that I know would be defined as having a drinking problem, but they all, and this includes me, drink recreationally quite a bit. You know, get together and have not just one martini, but two martinis, and we make jokes about how you know, how we're going to get home, and it's really a drinking culture, and yet. And I want to say, if I'm taking Rebecca Lemon's definition, I want to say it's an addiction. Yeah, but I want to say it's a mild addiction, and I want to say, well, you know, nobody seems to be suffering from it. We can afford the two martinis, and sometimes it's three, and we can afford it, and it's not getting worse. You know, people aren't becoming, you know, dropping out and becoming alcoholic and, you know, going off into hell. That's not happening. But I want to say, maybe again, to go back to Rebecca Lemon, maybe addiction in its milder forms is not necessarily positive, but it's at least non-negative and it's functional. And so now we have people who make their lives work in a reasonable way by drinking in a slightly unreasonable way. Does that fit? Is that part of the picture?
Well, I mean, my question immediately back to that would be, what is the addiction to? I don't really think, if we're using this earlier notion of addiction, are you not just merely addicted to conviviality?
Sure, but you're talking about the guys who had the best times of their life in the bar.
Yeah.
What were they addicted to? Would it not be conviviality, that which, you know, alcohol fueled conviviality, to be sure?
Well, I mean, in your work, you do say this. You point out that for many people who become full-blown addicts like myself, there is a period of time where the substance abuse actually affords relief,
Yeah,
from dislocation.
yeah.
So now the question is, why does that peer group that I belong to go the full and pay the postage too? You know, I have no real answer for you.
And I don't either. I mean, I think we're in unmarked territory here, but I think, you know, there's some virtue in the idea that addiction, of course, is a perilous gift, and part of the way we avoid the peril is by moderating it, so that it would make sense in that way to talk about um, all addictions being somehow potentially dangerous, and yet all being potentially valuable. And if we do that, of course, we're leaving the 19th century definition of addiction far behind us. We're in uncharted territory,
Well, even 20th century too, really.
yeah, and 21st. And we're saying that, look, we're in a new world here. We're in an absolutely unprecedented modern world. No one has ever been here before. Um, and we're learning to live in this new world. And we don't know how to do it very well. And that's why we have so many casualties. And that's why, California catches fire in the summer, and all these, we have all these dangers and problems. But we're learning to live in this world, and that may be a proper understanding of devotion and faith and addiction um, is is somehow something we're working on. We're trying to achieve it, and we haven't achieved it yet. And even like I love resistance recovery. I mean, this is a wonderful idea, and people get together for conversation. And you talk, Piers, about how important this conversation is as a part of community. But of course, um, we don't really know how to do it yet.
Mm.
And am I right? That I mean, we
Well, we certainly did. Kent had something a while back.
Yeah, I don't know how helpful this will be, but it strikes me that one of the things that we're pushing up against here is the insight that addiction in the bad sense, addiction in the sense in which a person would lament being in the state, would feel that their life is being destroyed by being in the state that they're in. It always is it's not a mere dependence, because Bruce has just described all kinds of ways in which we can I have a dependence to coffee, that my day will be real rough without it, right? So we know that we have all of these dependencies, and they don't cause us any problems at all. We tend to think that we tend to use the label of addiction in the pejorative sense to describe a dependence that draws us into patterns of life that put us in conflict with other expectations that we have of ourselves, and that therefore lead us into a form of denial or self-deception. So I think what happens is that if I have a certain dependence that leads me, for example, to miss appointments with my family that I believe for my own reasons are important, I'm now in a position where my life doesn't make sense to myself. I have to tell myself lies about what's going on in order to sustain a narrative of myself as a decent person. And this is why, so many addicts say that denial is not just a river in Egypt and all this stuff, And here's the point that I want to make that I think connects with what Bruce is saying. Our sense of what a good human life looks like is itself not a natural kind. It's something that's given to us by the community that we're in. So to use as an example, these young people that you're talking about, Piers, I seriously wonder how our concept of addiction is going to shift as people become more and more accustomed to the idea that you could potentially lead a flourishing human life on strictly work from home and social media means of connecting with other people. Think about what that does. It basically makes all of your human connections more or less on your own schedule. And it produces a situation in which a person, say a modern young person who recognized that their drug of choice was keeping them in isolation from other people, would no longer have the contrast class that people in our generation have, where they can say, there's something about my life as it used to be when I would have said it was flourishing, where I was making my appointments, I was out in the world, I was meeting with friends in different places. And there's a contrast between that life and what this drug has made me do, where I live in isolation, I can't keep my appointments, so on and so forth. But as that sense of what is normal shifts, so I think will our sense of what is unhealthily addictive. And so I do think that what strikes us as a form of dependence that is wrecking our lives depends upon those background assumptions about what a good human life is. In a medieval society where there was no problem with the men in the family staying in the bar all weekend after the end of a hard work week. It simply didn't occur to anyone that this was a pathological behavior, right? But now we live in a society in which that's seen as not part of normal human flourishing. And so that pattern of behavior gets characterized as addiction. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense.
Yep.
So it really raises a profound question of is what constitutes a life of human flourishing, is that totally up for grabs now? I mean, are we so particular or atomized or retribalized, or whatever you want to call it, that we have no consensus around?
I think it's not up for grabs, but I think it's up for discovery, because we have never been here before. We've never been in a society with so many layers, which go from the nuclear family to the globe, and we have to consolidate all those layers, and we have to discover it if it's discoverable. I mean, it's conceivable that we've gone too far, that there's a limit to what our species and what our human intelligence can cope with, and it's not discoverable. But I think our business is not grabbing, but discovering.
Well, that's so interesting, because it strikes me that for most of human history, this was more or less a given.
Yeah.
It was not a question of discovering. I mean, maybe you fumbled along and came to better accommodations for harvesting or something, but we inherited it. We were born into it, weren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're in a time when we have, unprecedented technological reach. And yet, I'm thinking about this recent documentary on Netflix. I think it's called The Social Network, where you have all these founders of the big tech companies, founders of Facebook, founders of Google, and they themselves are saying, look, we didn't know what we were making, but now that we've made it and we're seeing what it's doing to people, we won't, they'll say, I won't let my kids use social media. So the very people who gave us the capacities, and they meant them for good, are now looking at the hard data of what is happening to their children and just saying, these tools take us beyond what appears to be healthy for human functioning. Or I just think about the way that the coverage of global catastrophes has essentially, anesthetized us to pain. And it's made it very hard for us to feel compassion on the local level because we're inundated with catastrophe on a global scale. I think in all these ways, we're trying to renegotiate what a life of human flourishing looks like. And as a generally conservative person, I'm not going to be surprised if we find out that it turns out to be much what we thought, like living locally, meeting people face to face, having meals together. But I think we need to be really modest about it and say, look, maybe we have things to learn about what human flourishing looks like. And the conversation about what addiction is and what human flourishing looks like are always two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Wow.
This is why I wanted to do this.
I have one more question for you, Piers, because like recovery, resistance recovery has a kind of an edge to it, right? I mean, there's a negative as well as a positive in that. And you also use the term recovery activist, which is kind of a politicized term. And I always wonder as I think about this, you didn't choose those terms accidentally. I mean, I'm sure those terms have a, what is being resisted here?
Well, I mean, the more extreme narrative would be that not only does addiction rend the social fabric, but it's also very profitable to certain parties.
Okay.
And so the treatment of addiction or mass incarceration, arguably the medicalization of addiction, really, that's just a boon for big pharma, especially in the States.
God.
So
No.
the resistance is that there's a certain body of knowledge that can at least spare people some pain or their families.
Yes.
It's kind of like, who's the guy who ran for president forever? The consumer advocate.
Nader.
Yeah, it's a kind of a Nader thing there. But there's also a more sinister side to it where, I had no immunity in 1974 when I started getting high against sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The Rolling Stones and my friends' big brothers and the girls and all that, I had no immunity to it. And I don't believe that an 11-year-old boy who's smoking pot every chance he can be held, to the standards of adulthood and choice. So there's a certain, it sells, and it's marketed to the people who lack the wherewithal to be critical about it. So those are aspects of the resistant part of it. Yeah.
But to some extent, it's a resistance to market forces.
It is, and it's also born of the belief that the change will have to come from the community itself, and not from politicians or the medical establishment.
Yeah.
So it does believe that things like conversation and reading books are deeply radical. Yeah. So some of the content, if you look on there, let's look at some of the things that are actually edgy. Christianity is actually edgy in that community. Right? Taking on big pharma is edgy, but not as edgy as it once was. The military, the prison industrial complex, not really that edgy. Race is still quite edgy. That people with black and brown skin are disproportionately either they can't access treatment or they're incarcerated, at least in the States. And some things that people don't like to talk about much, if you would look at my interviews with people like Doug Valentine, the actual geopolitical machinations of the world of drugs. What that money funds, where that money gets laundered, the relationship to despotic regimes, or flooding South Central LA with cocaine during Iran-Contra, all those things. And you see the real issue is that the one place where we congregate as addicts, faithfully, AA meetings, NA meetings, CA meetings, we are forbidden to have these conversations because there's this thing called the 10th tradition that says you can't engage. So, I feel like, first I would try to reform those institutions. Fool's errand. I wouldn't recommend anyone trying that, because I did. So now you really have to create a venue where you can have these conversations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, with your work, Bruce, psychology departments are not a venue to have the conversation about your work. I mean, that's how crazy that is.
No,
Um,
no, I'm definitely a rogue psychologist. There was one other, I wanted to ask you guys if there's a minute more for it. I want to ask you to help me with something. I want to know. I'm asked to give a speech in Bolivia in a month. Not Bolivia, but Brazil, by Zoom, and I want to say that when we look at recovery techniques, that the kinds of recovery techniques which work the best historically and are things like AA has worked very well, things like the church, and things like resistance recovery, which is like recovery communities where people get together and not necessarily within the framework of AA or the Christian church, but people strive for. I want to say those are the most effective, just in terms of the number of people who are actually helped to deal in a positive way with their harmful addictions. Am I right?
I'll give it to Kent.
That's a great question. I think you're right, Bruce, but it is so hard to make the empirical argument because, among other things, like if you look at, I mean, you know all this stuff, but if you look at catchment surveys, right, the number of people that recover from addiction is a lot higher than you would think if you were tracing the media narrative. And
Yeah.
a lot of these stats come from the book, I think it's Gene Hayworth, his book on addiction,
Yes.
which
Right.
is a great book.
Or no, something like that.
Yeah, a failure of choice, or what, I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm thinking that, okay, if we just take the bulk of people who do in fact recover, who are never entered into a medicalized program of recovery, maybe not even into AA, what factors into their recovery? In all likelihood, it's family pressures, church pressures, it's communities of pressure.
Yes.
And so if we tried to quantify those numbers, I'm quite sure that even setting aside formal attendance at AA, it probably is church and communal expectations and pressures that are the explanation for most folks' recovery. But there is also a literature I'd have to track down, but there are studies that try to quantify this and do suggest that AA, even if we try to quantify things, that AA is the most successful form. 12-step recovery programs are the most successful, but it's highly contested and it's so incredibly hard to even know how to do the empirical work that would be necessary to validate it. So yeah, I'm inclined to think it's true, but you'd be hard pressed to prove it.
Well, that's my problem. Yeah, and of course in in Heyman's analysis, which you've referred to, I mean, he also tells a lot of stories about guys who just say, "Okay, that's it," and they do it and they mean it, and it is. So that happens too.
It does, although you would never know it by the way people talk about addiction.
No,
it does happen.
It's a taboo topic in the recovery world.
Right.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The idea that people walk away from heroin addiction, you know, immediately the recovery community goes, well, they weren't really addicts. They were just dilettantes. They're lying. They didn't tell you that they're presently addicted to marijuana. You know, there's always got to be some explanation. There's no room for the anomalous. Of late, I've been using, you know, another thing that really gets me is, and you can kind of hear it in your recent comments, both of you, is that we're not making a very clear distinction between recovery and sobriety. And the problem with this is, you know, sobriety can be a very quantitative thing. X percentage of people are sober 3 years after treatment, so on and so forth. But there are many people who achieve sobriety, but are far from flourishing.
Yeah.
So many of them wind up in what you would call, well, what's called process addictions. And this is provisional, but the definition of recovery that I've been using lately is recovery involves the identification and resolution of the factors that gave rise to the addiction to begin with.
Yeah.
And that, of course, implies, you know, if it's trauma, if it's marriage, if it's biological pain, if it's, you know, it sets in motion that there are things that have to be addressed beyond putting down a vodka bottle.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't, but you see, even in the academic world or in the clinical world, you will never meet, or you will rarely meet, an academic or a clinician that makes a distinction between sobriety and recovery.
That's amazing to me. That, I mean,
It's
because
horrible.
it's so obvious. So as you put it, it is so obviously true that just to leave a person white knuckling and suffering is that's not much.
No, it's not. It's hardly success. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I don't want to keep you too long, but I did notice that Kent seemed to get something from the bookshelf.
Oh yeah. You know, Bruce, I have a big long footnote in a somewhat recent article that I wrote where I try to wade through the social scientific data on whether or not AA works and how it compares to alternatives.
Will you
So
do that?
I'll just send it to you.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
I'll just send it to you.
I want that. Because I think it's true, but as you say, it's so slippery. We can't measure these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, but we need to have the conversations.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, this has been I hope it was as pleasurable for you as it was for me. I've been looking forward to it, and you guys have done fantastic work, and I'm sure that this will give you even more readers. So.
Well, I loved it. Thank you both. I mean, this has really been a great morning for me.
Likewise, it was a delight to be with both of you. Thanks for inviting us on, Piers, and great to meet you, Bruce.
All right. Well, till we speak again.
Yep.
So long. Bye-bye.